Okay, hi. It's great to see everybody again. Even with the blinding spotlights, I can kind of make out some fuzzy shapes here. But it's nice to be here, and today I'm going to be talking about cross-platform user interfaces in Dyalog. And so first, I'd like to talk about what our goals are. And first of all, we want to make it possible for you to build sophisticated user interfaces that will run on any Dyalog APL platform. And not only do we want to make it possible, we'd like to make it easy and maybe even fun. We want to try and minimize the knowledge that the user is going to need to use some of the underlying technologies. And in this case, those technologies are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But for people that do know about those technologies, we want them to be able to leverage the full capabilities of those underlying technologies. So first, I'll give you a bit of history. QuadWC was invented in the early 1990s, thanks to JD. And for the past quarter of a century, it's been the standard for writing Dyalog user interfaces on Windows platforms. MiServer was introduced in 2011, and it provides a cross-platform way of writing user interfaces based on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they can either run on a network or locally on your network in a browser on your own machine. And then we introduced HTMLRenderer with version 16 last year, and this provides a cross-platform means to render CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, but without requiring you to have a browser. So it provides a more native look and feel. So we've kicked around a couple of terms the past few days, GUI and WC2. So I'd like to try and set some context so that we know what we're talking about. So back in a few years ago, we introduced MiServer 3.0, which introduced an object-oriented way of describing HTML pages. And then we released MiServer 3.1, and we had this thing called EAWC, which stood for Easy as QuadWC. And what we tried to demonstrate then was that it was comparable to develop, comparable in terms of complexity, to develop a MiServer-based interface as it was to develop a QuadWC interface. And we changed EAWC to WC2, and I've called it web content construction. Some people have thought it meant the QuadWC2, but that wasn't the original intent, so I wanted to clarify any ambiguity there. Then with GUI, we've corrected some of the sins of MiServer and into MiServer 3.2, and we've introduced HRServer, which is an HTML renderer based server, and both of those use WC2 to generate their content. And so this whole framework is what we call GUI, or Dyalog User Interface. And one of the things I found in working at Dyalog is that sometimes it's almost as hard to come up with a name of something as it is to write something itself. And so my thinking is that if somebody comes up to me and asks, does Dyalog have a cross-platform user interface framework, I can just say, GUI? Sorry. Okay, the groans were appropriate, so that's good. Okay. So why would you want to use WC2? So there's not actually anything called WC2, but it's sort of the embodiment of all of the content generating capabilities that come along with this framework. So you can describe a very simple page here that basically adds a headline or a heading that has the text hello world in it, and then when you click on it with your mouse, it will call an APL function named foo. Okay, so I find that that's a lot easier to type than the equivalent HTML that this winds up getting rendered to. So we try and simplify the process of building content. And now let's see if I... Oh, there it is. Okay. So what I've got here is a clear workspace. I've loaded the GUI framework, and now I'm going to say GUI run MS3. And some of you may recognize this as the MiServer 3 sample page, or sample application. And so you can go through and look at the controls or the samples, and you can get details about samples, and this all works. And if you go out to MiServer.Dyalog.com, you'll see this very same page. But this is all running under HTMLRenderer now. And without any change in the code, you can also run it under MiServer. So So I've got this same command here, GUI.run. So to run it under HTMLRenderer, I used GUI run get GUI ms3. So that's just a folder that contains the MiServer 3 sample site contents. And now if I say run it on port 8080, you'll see that it started up a server. And if I click on that, it brings up a browser. And HTMLRenderer is faster than the browser, so that's kind of cool. So you see the exact same contents. We're running the exact same code between HTMLRenderer and MiServer. Okay. So in yesterday's workshop, I introduced a little biorhythm application. And it turns out there's some APL history here. Back when I was in high school, I was involved in a program called Junior Achievement, where different corporations would come in and sponsor companies that students would run as a corporation. And the company that I was associated with, which was sponsored by Kodak, was called Paras. And our Finnish friends here will know that Paras means best, or the best in Finnish. And it's kind of interesting. Pekka Toivonen was the exchange student who was working with our company, and I can't understand why I can remember his name from 39 years ago, and I can't remember where I put my car keys this morning. So it's interesting how the brain is indexed. And anyhow, so I thought I'd show a little bit of history here. So that's a kind of a bad picture, but I was the president of the company, and yep, that's me. So, but this was at a trade show at Midtown Plaza. We collected people's names, phone numbers, and date of birth, and we sold over 50 biorhythms. So this was my first profitable APL application. Because if you notice, the text that we wound up taking their information back to the math lab at school, and we printed these things off and mailed them to them. But sure enough, that's from a 2741 APL type ball. So I'm probably dating myself, but that's okay. I'm kind of proud of my APL history. So why did we choose this application? Well, it was a manageable size to use in the workshop yesterday, and it's got a lot of the elements that a typical application would have. So it's got input elements, some graphical output, and some callbacks. And so I'll show you that real quick. So I've loaded GUI into the workspace. I'm going to initialize it, and now I'll run the biorhythm program. And sure enough, there it is. So now I happen to know we have an illustrious member of our community has a birthday coming up this week. And so I thought I would check on his biorhythms. Uh-oh. Well, it looks like Morton has got a critical day. So a critical day is when things are kind of in flux and you need to be a little careful. So Morton has got an emotional critical day coming up on November 1st. Okay, so when you attend his workshop on Thursday, go easy on him. So, and you can see here that, we can scroll back and forth in time and with a little bit of animation. So what's the code for this look like? Well, okay, so we've got a little utility function here to format some data, but basically we're creating a new page and setting its size, adding a title for the window. We're adding an input form here. We're adding an output division so that we can display the name about how many days Morton's been alive. And then this is all options to set for the chart. So we enabled the animation. We've set the intervals for the y-axis and so on. We've said that the x-axis is a date-time axis, and its format is month-day. And then we've got our controls, our fast-forward and rewind controls down at the bottom. And then we run the page. Okay, and then what this does is I set a callback here on the date picker. So we've got the date picker object that we added to the form. And then I set a callback that says whenever the value in the date picker changes, call this function. So it's going to call this function, but this time with an argument. So at the very top, we check to see if the argument is empty. If it is empty, we just initialize the page. If it isn't empty, then that's a callback. And then all I do is I get the name, date of birth, and the current position on the time scale. And if the date of birth changed, I reset the position to 0. If you didn't enter a date of birth, I fuss at you. Otherwise, I calculate some new data, assign it to the graph, and then reanimate the chart and reset the new value on the timeline. So I didn't try and write this using QuadWC, but I can't imagine that it would be, I can imagine that it would be about the same in terms of difficulty and complexity of code. I could be wrong, and somebody is welcome to do it. But I want to show you so I'll show you a very minimalist GUI application. So again, I'm just going to initialize the framework, and then let's take a look at the reverse function. So again, we are creating a new page. I'm adding a form to the page to which I'm adding an input element that's a text input, and it has a prompt of enter some text, and I'm calling that text input, I'm giving it the name or the ID INP. And then I'm adding a button with the caption reverse it, and then when that button is clicked, I'm going to call a function called reverse callback. And if we want to look at reverse callback, it just gets the request from the callback, grabs the value of the input, and then does a reverse on it. And Morton fussed at me about this name, and that will probably change to be something a little more meaningful. To me, this is the JavaScript snippet that executes the val function from jQuery. But since a lot of people aren't going to have that same context, we'll try and give it a better name. And then all I do is I just reset the input value, or the value of the input element, to the reverse of its data. So now if we run that, and we enter some text, and reverse it back, and reverse it back, it just works. So, when we compare WC2 with QuadWC, the biggest difference that I can see, well, there are some differences when you create the page content, because with QuadWC, you spend a lot of time and effort laying out positions and sizes of things on your form. And with QuadWC or HTML-based rendering, a lot of that goes away. But independent of that, the biggest difference that I think exists is how you interact with the page after it's been rendered. With QuadWC, you have direct access to the elements on the page and their values. So if I had a control on the page called life, I could set its value to 42 and it would be reflected immediately in the user interface. However, in WC2, I currently have to wait for a callback from the page, and then I say something like, okay, set the value of the thing with the ID life to 42. And HTMLRenderer now supports WebSockets, and so one of the next iterations is going to allow us to have some more immediacy in terms of being able to interact with the page. And so this difference is likely to diminish, and my goal is to make it go away in some future release of GUI. So I'm saying, WC2 is not a QuadWC replacement, but over time it may evolve to be more like QuadWC. So with GUI, you can write in workspace code functions or classes that implement the user interface that you want using HTMLRenderer. You can write a script file to implement a single page application and render it using either HTMLRenderer or MiServer. Or you can write a MiSite that includes configuration and styling and scripts and your own widgets and all kinds of things. So to implement a single or a multi-page application that can be run locally using HTMLRenderer or across a network using MiServer without changing any code. So what's the status? Well, WC2 has existed for several years, and whether it's been called that or not, really the framework for building that content has existed for a number of years. And it's been in MiServer since version 3.0. And GUI is really new, and it's going to use some HTMLRenderer features that will be available with version 17.1. So there is some functionality there under 17, but it will be more complete in 17.1. Both GUI and WC2 need more documentation, and that was brought out painfully yesterday in the workshop that one of our users who had tried to use MiServer and to accomplish some things had a very difficult time navigating through the documentation that's there. So one of our serious efforts in the tools group over the next several months will be to bolster the documentation, the samples, the templates that we provide, and any tutorials. So we would like to release GUI coincident with Dyalog 17.1 next year. And I guess Jay said it's early next year, so tools group, we're going to be busy. And then some possible future developments include data binding. Well, that's not a possible, it's a definite thing that we will be developing is data binding in WC2 or in GUI. Again, we want to move the object model closer to what you see with QuadWC. We want to have selective configuration because right now if you load all of GUI, you get about 160 megabytes of stuff, which includes all of the Syncfusion JavaScript controls and data tables and some other third-party JavaScript libraries. And if you're just running a simple application that doesn't need any of that, there's no reason that you should have to carry around 160 megabytes of extra stuff. So we want to allow you to configure packages that you can deploy that only have the pieces that you need. And then I'm also thinking that, and actually I'd like some feedback from people, we're thinking about implementing it such that if you point GUI or HTML, HR server or MiServer at a namespace, or point GUI at a namespace that contains a number of classes and or functions to implement your pages without having any of them on file, that we can serve basically a namespace up as an entire website or site. So if there's any interest in that, please, say so and let us know, because it's something I've thought about. I thought it would be kind of neat to do, but if there's no demand for it, I've got plenty of other things that we can be doing. So, and I think that's it.